This is our last session. It's a really big deal. It's very, very, very important. And this is about ADHD and suicide. And it's being done by, well, I'll bring her in. It's being done by, once I can find the correct screen, it's being done by Seonaid Cleare, who's at the University of Glasgow. And this is an overview of the research working and being done at the University of Glasgow. Its title is sponsored by ADHD UK. The reality is there's an incredible woman called Jane Roberts. It's all her money. It went through the charity, but it's her, and she is supporting the charity. And has become a trustee. She's an incredibly important person to us, and her drive for change is something else. And it comes from an absolute tragedy that her son, Ben Roberts, took his own life, and he had ADHD, and and consequences of that, and it was undiagnosed for a very long time. And the consequences of that led to that awful result. It's Ben, Jane Roberts' son, and and so she's sponsored this research through the charity. Seonaid, shall I just hand over to you to and open up the presentation? And the University of Glasgow is a specialist centre for research into suicide. It's incredibly important area of expertise. Right, over to you.
Thank you very much. As Henry says, this is a massively important area of research, and I'm delighted to be along at such an incredible event to tell you a bit about it. This project is funded by ADHD UK, and as Henry said, particularly by Jane Roberts, who unfortunately lost her son to suicide. Obviously, suicide is a very sensitive, very personal issue. And I just wanted to take a wee second to point out that in the bottom of my slides, there's a rocket ship. This is a link to a website which has kind of international resources and things. So if there's anything today that comes up that anybody feels they would like to talk about further or discuss with other people, then please, please, please use those resources. So today, what I thought I would do is basically my two main aims for this presentation are to give you a little bit of the overview of kind of ADHD and suicide risk, and then to talk about the kind of scale and challenges that suicide research or that faces suicide research. So could we go into the first slide, please? Thank you. So I know everybody here knows a lot more about ADHD than I do, in all honesty. But just for completeness, I thought I would just give a wee overview of it. So basically, as we are aware, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition that the symptoms commonly appear during childhood. And a diagnosis is based on the presence of persistent and impairing levels of hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity. And they obviously can appear in kind of to varying degrees. Sorry, train going fast. And so the graph, the line graph that's there, just gives an overview of prevalence of ADHD in children. And it's data from 2003 to 2011. But I thought it was a very nice indication of how the diagnosis of ADHD has increased in childhood. And as you can see, this represents a 43% increase from between 2003 and 2011. And as we are aware, estimates across the globe are between 2 to 7% currently. In adults, there was a recent World Health Organization survey, which was conducted across 20 countries. And this indicated that rates of ADHD ranged from about 0.6% to 7.3% across the globe. And this averaged out at 2.8%. So the numbers that are under the bar chart, so a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today is research into the area, and obviously the numbers and the rates that we're seeing in research can vary quite a bit. And I thought this was a really good example because the statistics that are there, the percentage, the 3.5% is the results from a recent study looking at prevalence of ADHD in medical students in China. And then the prevalence of over a quarter was recently found in a study that was conducted in Ireland by Brown and colleagues. And that looked at kind of multiple university institutions, and the data was weighted to be more representative of the population. But just in terms of the numbers that I'm going to be discussing today, a lot of them can vary depending on how conditions have been measured, the population that's been assessed, and that sort of thing. So I thought I would just clarify that before we move on. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So regardless of the studies, regardless of the population, regardless of measurement of assessment measures, the one continuous thing we do see is that there is an association between people having ADHD and suicidal ideation. And a lot of studies do have this as coming in roundabout. People with ADHD are maybe twice as likely to experience suicidal ideation. And again, that study from Ireland by Brown and colleagues found that 44.8% of individuals who had ADHD, who scored on ADHD measures, had experienced suicidal ideation in their lifetime. And this was compared to around about 20% of people who didn't score for having ADHD. So there's a similar pattern seen for suicide attempts. The literature around suicide plans is a bit more varied. But in terms of suicide attempts, there are people with ADHD symptoms or a diagnosis of ADHD are more likely in some research to report having experienced kind of suicidal behaviours. And in a study in 2019 that was conducted in a Danish registry sample, this study looked at research that had been, hospital attendances for suicidal behaviour over a 20-year period. And what they found was that over the 20 years, overall, people with ADHD were more likely to have attended or to have had medical support for a suicidal behaviour. And this was round about 4 times more prevalent in people with ADHD than it was with people who didn't have ADHD. And in this study, they found quite a gender difference. So in men with ADHD, the prevalence of attending for a suicidal behaviour was around about 4 times more likely for them to attend than it was for people without a history of ADHD. And for women, the increase was around about 9 times more. They were 9 times more likely to have sought help for a suicide behaviour. Again, that's over 20 years. And one of the things as well that makes this really difficult, and I will discuss it a bit more later, is it's really challenging because we know that people will experience suicidal thoughts, suicidal behaviours, and they might never ever seek treatment. So again, the hospital data is really interesting, but doesn't quite give us a full picture. Another thing that adds to this really complex relationship is obviously in terms of ADHD, there's a high rate of other conditions occurring alongside it. So a lot of studies indicate that people who have ADHD also have kind of mood disorders, anxiety disorders. A lot of the literature suggests that if in people who don't have a diagnosis of a mood disorder, they maybe have higher rates of depressive or anxiety symptoms. And this just really adds another layer of complexity to understanding this relationship, because it's not clear. It's not clear the nature of this relationship a lot of the time, and a lot of the data that is existing at the moment is cross-sectional. So we can tell it's associated with kind of thoughts about suicide, that sort of thing, but we don't actually understand how the relationship actually works. And it is really important for me to point out as well that most people with ADHD won't experience suicidal behaviours. And so this is something we see quite a lot in other kind of areas for suicide research, in that I think around about one of the most common statistics is that 90% of people who die by suicide have, say, a mood disorder or other kind of diagnosable psychiatric condition at that point. However, when you look at the kind of population overall, this actually equates to around about 5% of people who have, for instance, depression. So I know the numbers are they are big, and it is a major problem, a really big concern that obviously highly important to look into and kind of understand more of. But just I'm aware that I don't want to come across as very too alarmist. And like I say, we really need to understand the relationship more. So again, a further complexity is that the research into the different kind of subtypes and the symptomology of ADHD is a bit sparse, but there is some indication that there are different relationships between inattention symptoms and suicidal ideation, or hyperactivity and suicidal ideation as well. And sometimes these can be through, it looks as though the relationship might be communicated through different factors. So multivariate models and mediation models have shown that in some situations inattention might be associated with suicidal ideation through daydreaming or impairments that are brought on by rumination, that sort of thing as well. So again, it's at this point it's very early, and we really need to understand this relationship more fully. And basically there's a dearth of research in this really important area. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So I thought now we would just take a wee step back and look at the scale and the challenge that's presented by suicide research across the world. So as we know, suicide affects people across the globe to varying degrees, and the graph that you can see in front of you, the world map, the different colours represent the rates of suicide across the globe. And as you can see, there's a couple of areas where we can't get data from, but like I say, it's a global problem. And in 2019, it was estimated that 703,000 people died by suicide. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And what that equates to is that every 1 in 100 deaths is from suicide, which means that more people die from suicide than die from HIV, malaria, breast cancer, war, or homicide. And one of the things we currently don't know is how many of those deaths involve people with ADHD. And a further complexity is obviously that the identification of ADHD in adulthood remains incredibly poor, unfortunately. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So obviously, again, thinking about the burden of suicide, as I already said, suicide hospital presentations and actually suicide deaths, they don't represent the extent of the burden of suicidal behaviour. So for those 703,000 deaths from suicide, those individual tragedies, there's a potential, it's estimated like a potential 135 people could be impacted from each one of those deaths, which makes the impact of suicide around about 95 million people potentially affected every year from suicide. And I always think one of the most startling statistics is that every 42nd, one person dies by suicide. And in that time, a further 20 people will make a suicide attempt. And again, just to go back to that, the paradox around, the gender paradox around suicide. As we know, there are more men die by suicide than women, but women are more likely to make a suicide attempt than men. In the UK, 75% of suicides are by men, and suicide is the leading cause of death among men aged 35 to 49, and for men and women aged 20 to 34. There's also data from the National Centre of Health Statistics in America, which indicated a 56% increase in suicides in young people, so aged 10 to 24, between 2007 and 2017. And again, at this point, we are unable to answer the question that how many families of people with ADHD are affected by suicide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I said, suicide is an incredibly complex phenomenon that occurs from a range and an interaction between various factors. And I think this model, it's a biopsychosocial model of suicide risk, and I think this just really gives a kind of a glimpse into just how complicated and complex this phenomena is. So this model obviously emphasizes the biological, my computer was trying to restart. So it's trying to, emphasizes the biological, psychological and social factors and their complex interactions. So things like, and it also gives quite a holistic approach in that we can't consider these factors in isolation. We have to look at them as a kind of integrated model for how these impact individuals. And we have to take them into consideration. So in the top box is the kind of social context of which suicidal thoughts and behaviours may develop. And we cannot even begin to consider these factors for individuals without taking the social context into their lives. So things like economic turmoil or social isolation, these sorts of things. And then obviously we have to look at this in a lifespan approach. In the early life events can increase or change somebody's vulnerability to stress. And then obviously the impact that these factors have on somebody's suicide risk will vary between individuals, and is the interplay is affected by all the factors you can see in this model. And sorry, I'm trying to make it a bit bigger. And obviously, like down in the proximal factors bit, we've got this really emphasises the importance of psychological factors, especially in the development of kind of dysregulated mood, and it highlights the importance of entrapment, which I'll talk about a bit more in my next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the integrated motivational volitional model of suicidal behaviour, and it was basically created by Rory O'Connor to basically help us figure out how the kind of common pathway from in the emergence of suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviour. So basically, I know this is a really complicated model to look at. It's actually not, it's not as complicated as it looks at first sight. But essentially in this model, it kind of, the pre-motivational phase just gives factors which might increase somebody's vulnerability to stress. The motivational phase talks about factors which are pertinent in potentially pertinent in developing suicidal ideation. And then into the volitional phase, we have factors which may be implicated in the transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. And the two things I'm going to focus on really today are basically just to explain a little bit about how we think suicidal ideation develops, so the motivational phase. And then I'll say a bit more about the factors that differentiate between people who have thoughts about suicide and people who go on to engage in suicidal behaviour. So the main drivers of this model in the motivational phase are in the presence are defeat and entrapment. So this model says that in the when somebody encounters an experience that might make them feel defeated, it's the emergence of feelings of entrapment that will lead to potentially them feeling more suicidal or having thoughts about suicide. So when they feel they can't escape from the situation, and that is more likely to lead to thoughts about suicide. And then in the emergence of suicidal behaviours, it's a different set of factors. And what is really nice about this model is the fact that it gives us testable pathways to look at the emergence of suicidal thoughts and then suicidal behaviours. And the motivational phase, defeat and entrapment, have repeatedly been linked with suicidal thoughts. And the volitional factors, which we'll go into in the next slide, please, have been more associated, thank you, with the transition from thoughts to behaviours. So when somebody is having thoughts about suicide, it would stand to potentially, if they've got access to means, then it might make the likelihood of them engaging in suicidal behaviour more likely. And the same in terms of one of the ones that might be incredibly important to look at in terms of ADHD is if somebody's feeling suicidal and they're impulsive, basically like that could lead somebody to be at increased risk to suicide. So this is one of the things we're going to look at. If we could go into the next slide, please. Thank you. So basically, we understand that ADHD is associated with increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviours, but currently we don't know why. And we're not 100% sure what factors increase risk and when. So IMV factors have been found to be useful in highlighting indicators of potential early risk. And one of the things we're really keen to look at are which might be better to help us understand why some people with ADHD are increased risk of suicide. And we're going to use the IMV to kind of map out our hypothesis and test these. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So basically, the programme of research we have, like I say, it's just getting started, is looking at, it's a programme that's going to run for about 18 months. And there's 3 phases to it. The first phase, we're looking at just to find out what the current literature says about the relationship between ADHD and suicide risk. And this is mostly so as we can try to identify gaps in our knowledge. And then we will figure, we can extend on the research to kind of really address these gaps. So in terms of the current literature, there was a review published in 2018, and we are using the same methodology as that to just really kind of hone in the most recent research. And so far we found 50 papers that we're going to really go into depth with. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. So that will help us inform and figure out where to go for phase 2. And in phase 2, we are going to conduct an online survey of people who have ADHD, people without ADHD, and this will be really to test components of the IMV and see which, like I said, if there's any factors which could be most pertinent for identifying people who may be at increased risk of suicide. And then the third and probably most important part of the study is going to be carrying out interviews with people with a history of ADHD and suicidal thoughts and behaviours, and just really exploring the model in depth in this. And yeah, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So hopefully in 18 months, we will have a better understanding of the ADHD and suicide relationship. And yeah, thank you very much. If anybody's got any questions.
Thank you very much. And we do have some questions that have been popped in. This should just work. If I was to jump around cameras. Thank you for putting the QR code into your presentation. People would have seen I also put it up in a slightly larger format. For people in the UK, also you can go to ADHD UK. If you go to the bottom, and there's a link "Need Help Now," which will direct you to care within the UK. So it's clearly absolutely important to get help if you're in that situation, or you know someone who is. Those same agencies will talk to people who have someone they to give you advice if there's someone you think is at risk of suicide. And obviously, if you think it's a clear and present danger right now, then you call 999 or your emergency service wherever you are. Thank you for that. Like, it's obviously incredibly the numbers you presented were stark, and the impact that you showed was absolutely stark. It's obviously extremely sobering. We know from some of the evidence and you talked about that people with ADHD are at higher risk, and trying to understand that. And I think some of that understanding of what are the sort of co-conditions that make someone at higher risk has the potential to yield very, very important information, and to help target support, and also to be able to recognise more situations that are significantly more dangerous. When we talked a long time ago, well, not so long, but a little while. It feels like a long time ago. It's been 24 hours. Actually, it's been, and everything feels a long time ago right now. I think one of the things that I was struck by was which you intuitively knew, which I hadn't recognised, was the difference between the fact that a lot of ADHD people, we know are really, really struggling. We know how difficult it is to have ADHD. We know the impacts of that. And but the piece that I think you're particularly looking into is what's the difference between someone who's having a really, really tough time and someone who has, is at high risk of suicide. And I was just confirming that is correct. That's
absolutely.
And in other mental health conditions, what have you seen can be some of the factors that play a significant impact?
To go back to the IMV model, one of the things we do see really coming through quite strongly in the literature is entrapment. So when somebody is in a situation that they don't feel they can escape from, for whatever reason, whether it's impaired kind of like goal adjustment, or impaired memory, recollection, and problem solving to get out of it. If they start to feel trapped and stuck in the situation, then that's quite often associated with kind of increased suicidal thoughts and things like that. But it's a very, very good question, because obviously it's unfortunately as well, it's not, if there was one factor, everything would be so much easier, but it's just such a complex interplay. Yeah.
I thought that, and that's quite, it's particularly, it's just it's very emotional, very sad. Like this, that point on it, on feeling trapped. But your point, it's not about physical entrapment; it's about being not able to think out of the thing and out of your position and situation.
Absolutely.
And people with ADHD will often talk about overwhelm, where they're locked out, like it just can't and how that aspect people will have had some familiarity with, and it is it's very important research you're doing. I think we're excited that you're doing it, and excited for the donation that's made that be able to happen. We probably should do some nuts and bolts in terms of like what should people do, like if they themselves have are feeling suicidal, like what would your recommendation be, and what would your recommendation be to people who feel that they know someone who might be?
I think always a go-to is, if possible, speak to people. And it can be really difficult, obviously, in terms of, sometimes we find people find it really difficult to speak to somebody they know about how they've been feeling, because sometimes there's a perception of that feeling putting it on somebody, and I would always recommend, like, that's why I think that the website and stuff that's linked, I find incredibly useful, because there's a ream of resources out there for people who are feeling in distress, and these people at the resources are trained to discuss these things, and it gives people a safe place with trained professionals to have a conversation with, and I think it's really important as well, if people do think that they do suspect that somebody they know is struggling, then I think it is really important to ask the person directly, and just try to have an open dialogue to find out how they've been feeling. Obviously, if you are concerned, like you said, Henry, contact emergency services. If you are really concerned that somebody cannot keep themselves safe, or you feel you can't keep yourself safe, please contact emergency services. Please don't suffer in silence.
And the you in case that isn't working for people, and for the global audience, so it's findahelpline.com that you've directed people to. The other, so we've had some questions come in, so if I'll go through those. One is someone offering themselves up, recruitment for researchers, someone with lived experience of ADHD and suicidal ideation in previous attempts. Can I participate in your research?
We are currently not at the point of recruiting, but I really appreciate the offer, and if you can get my email, which is on the slides, please feel free to pop me an email, and that goes for absolutely anybody. We have a phenomenal, a lot of people who've contacted us for other research are really keen to be kept on board for learning about future things as well. So we do have, thank you. We have a database of people, and if anybody would like to be added to it, we can certainly, we'd be delighted to link people in with our future research. So sometimes the research does involve coming to Glasgow, so I know that might not be practical, but certainly we can let people know about research that's up and coming, so please feel free to drop me an email or find me on Twitter.
Yeah, and rather than attempt to, after 24 hours, attempt to spell everything out correctly, well, it's Seonaid Cleare, and it's Seonaid Cleare Glasgow. .ac.uk. I'm going to go for seonaid.cleare at glasgow.ac.uk. Did I get it right? Wrong? It's actually quite... No, we're golden.
You did better than I do most days, so thank you.
Okay, I got it right though, that's the joke. Okay, good. And otherwise it's Seonaid Cleare on Twitter. Do get in touch. We will, at the point at which that happens, we obviously as a charity will also be putting it on our newsletter. So do, like, if you subscribe to that, that's another way you'll find out about it if you don't look to email now. But certainly we will obviously try and direct you or direct people on. So that's great. So yeah, do send her an email, and if you're watching this later, so not live, in the completely different from when those TV competitions. If you're watching this on catch up or like at a later date, please do not. So this is actually for a future list, and looking to have your interviews in what sort of time scale again?
We haven't got that far, but hopefully next year. Okay,
so sometime next year. So you can still get in touch if you're watching this later as well. That's going to be. We've had someone ask, and I think it's an important question because there's some misconceptions around this. What are the signs of suicidal tendencies? What should people look out for? And that's in other people.
Well, obviously anything that if you suddenly start noticing behaviour changes, maybe somebody withdrawing from situations, or somebody seeming particularly distressed about future, I always think it's really helpful to ask people as well, especially about kind of how they are feeling about the future more generally, and distracted by my face sorry. You
can look at my face as well if that helps at all.
Much better. But yeah, essentially, like, people withdrawing from situations, or if they are feeling, if they're talking about things that they maybe seem just distressed or depressed, hopeless. Again, sometimes it can be really, really difficult to pick up on these things, and I do think if you have any concerns about people, asking them. Just asking them how they currently feel about the future, how they're feeling more generally, if there's been anything that's happened recently. Again, going back to the entrapment thing, asking if there's any, just basically trying to get a sense, like, how do people feel? Are they thinking about the future? Are they, able to see past things? Are they feeling stuck? Are they feeling trapped? There's some really good resources, like the Samaritans website and NHS.
Yeah, and those are both directed from our Need Help Now page on the bottom of ADHD UK. So we've got some resources to direct to people. And I think something important, because I think a lot of people are very concerned that if they speak to someone individually about suicide and ask them that is in some way a bad thing. And I think,
Never.
Do you want to clarify that? Yeah.
Absolutely not. I mean, it's always scary. I personally would say that, like, it's not an easy thing to ask somebody if they are having thoughts about ending their life, and it's not an easy topic to have a conversation about. But a lot of the time, it can be a massive relief for people to be asked directly. And I know there is a myth around that, if you ask somebody about suicide, there's a potential that you're putting it into the forefront of their mind, that sort of thing. But there's not evidence to support that. The evidence is that, it's ask.
Yeah.
But would recommend asking.
And I think I think we're, no, and I think that's important, and I think that it's a good thing to say, and I think it's discussion in groups is, I think, not so recommended except within very structured environments, because then that does carry more.
One of the ways that I do find quite useful for asking is that sort of, if you're not comfortable asking directly, or the person you don't think might react that way, but sometimes saying, like, if somebody in your situation, I'm aware that other people might experience like thoughts around suicide, and I just wanted to check, is this something that's been around for you at the moment, that sort of thing, and just instead of, I don't know, opening it more, that instead of, I suppose, focusing in on somebody and making them feel like they already might feel quite isolated, and this might feel like a further isolation, whereas kind of including the kind of perspective of other people can be really helpful, I find.
That's a really interesting approach, and thank you. And I want to get your actual advice. So, like on groups, like what's your recommendation? So, talking within a wider group, be that.
I think that depends on the individuals. So there's some, for me, I find group settings quite difficult, and sometimes if I'm in that sort of situation, I might find that I withdraw more than maybe engaging more with people. So, sorry, I know that's a bit of a kind of a waffle answer, but it's certainly.
I think it's. I just wanted. It was important to cover. The other side I just wanted to touch on is for individuals who themselves are having suicidal thoughts. Is there a level of normal? And what point should they be going, you know what, I think I need to go and talk to someone?
Again, it's all individual. So one of the things we do know about suicidal thoughts is that they can increase and they also come back down. But it depends on the individual, and I would always recommend talking to people. I would always recommend, it's amazing, like the more conversations I have with people, the more I have realized that the number of people who experience thoughts about suicide are, it's, because I know it's a very isolating thing to have, and in that experience you feel alone in that moment, whereas actually just having a conversation about how you've been feeling, like just being open with people, maybe especially earlier, it might help stop things escalate. And obviously if you're feeling that the thoughts have escalated, speaking to somebody can be good for reducing the thoughts as well. So just the entire time, talk to people. But again, it's a really hard thing to answer, because it does all depend on the individual circumstances, the individual's tolerances, and what other kind of, I suppose, protective factors people have around them and things like that. So.
Oh, thank you. I think that wraps us up. That wraps up the conference. I have to do. I'll just do the wrap up. I want to thank you so much for coming and talking now, and so with such great information, such deep thought. It's obviously a very difficult topic, and I'm very grateful for you to being here to talk about it. I'm very grateful for the work you're doing. Clearly, it's incredibly important that link between ADHD and suicide. Like, we need to know more. We need to, so that we can help people and we can reduce that number. That's the aim, is to understand, to save lives. And so I thank you very much for
thank
that.
You, and congratulations on such an amazing event.
Thank you, and happily pivots us into the celebration and thank you stage, and we all go. So I'll say goodbye to you now. Thank you so much. Bye bye, and thank you. Have a great rest of your day. That was exciting.